So we've talked about, these, big producer countries from, now from the US to Saudi Arabia and others in the Arab world. But what about Russia? It's becoming a bigger player sort of militarily. It's got relationships with lots of countries that, for example, like Iran, that not everyone's very happy with. They are also a big oil producer. How should we be thinking about their role in all of this? They've become also closer to China as well.
Right.
Lots of questions.
Yes,
Russia.
And Russia is not only a big oil producer, but it's a big gas producer, and it's very mild at the moment. But as we go into winter in Europe, we should remember how much, about 30% of the gas that we import here in the region comes from Russia. And it's only a few years ago, in 2009, that we saw disruptions over a previous round of tensions in Ukraine. So it's very close to home for us here, the way Russia decides to act and the choices it makes. And I think there are lots of question marks over what is Vladimir Putin's goal and strategy. I think there are real weaknesses. The Russian economy was one of these ones that was too dependent on oil and gas revenues, that was unbalanced, that was even in the high price years. And now it faces, a major recession, much lower revenues, and Western sanctions over Ukraine. But none of that seems to have left Russia, to retreat or caused it to step back from confrontation. If anything, we've seen it escalate. We've seen it launch airstrikes in Syria. And I think some of that comes down to a view in Moscow, a view in the Kremlin, that Russia has a place on the world stage as a counterbalance to the US, as a counterbalance to the EU, and that place was wrongly taken from it for a couple of decades after the end of the Cold War, and now it needs to be reasserted. Russia spent a huge amount re-equipping its military, upgrading its defensive and attack capacities, but also in establishing alliances with states and with groups that the West refused to deal with. And I don't think we're yet entering a territory, as you sometimes see in the newspapers, of a new Cold War. But I definitely think how those relationships play out, both in individual settings, be it Syria, be it Ukraine, where there are very real proxy conflicts going on, but also on the global diplomatic stage, are going to be very critical to the 5-year, the 10-year direction of relations, as well as, and I'd be really interested to hear your views, Neil, on Russia's reliance, really, on a closer relationship with China. If it struggles or if it loses a market for some of its energy exports in Europe and in the West, it has to turn east. And that puts it in quite a weak bargaining position, perhaps.
Well, I have a very good answer on Russia. I'm not really an expert on Russia, but I do see it slightly from the Chinese perspective. And there, well, it's a very, very ambivalent situation. The Chinese love the idea of getting energy resources from Russia, particularly because it's one of the sources that are not... this is oil and gas that doesn't have to come through the Straits of Malacca, isn't all under the strategic control of the US. So they do definitely see it as a strategic aim to diversify and increase their supplies from Russia. But, as a lot of their Chinese regional relations, they are deeply suspicious of the Russians. It's not I think occasionally we see that sometimes they vote together at the UN and so we say, oh, they're together. No, the suspicions between China and Russia are very, very deep. They've been trying to negotiate a gas contract for at least 15 years. I think we were told last year it had finally been agreed, but actually progress in delivering it seems to be extraordinarily slow. So, and of course also some of the, this is relevant to our discussion on price, a lot of the resources that Russia could supply from the east of Russia to China are rather high cost. And so they're being somewhat squeezed out. So, yeah, it's a very fascinating relation.
Can I just add on Russia and the Middle East? Russia was always present in the Middle East with Saddam Hussein. I mean, they backed his regime. They backed the Assad father for a long time. So it's not that Russia just suddenly appeared. But the other thing, the Russian economy, I think, is much more resilient than we think. For one reason, its currency is flexible. It's not related to the dollar. With other currencies, usually if the dollar increases and they are fixed to the dollar, they increase as well. And when you sell your oil, you get money in dollar. By the time you chase them to your local currency, actually your revenues are much smaller if the oil price drops. Russian economy, because you have this flexibility and they are not really dependent on the strength or the weakness of the dollar, they are not suffering as much as people might have thought because of the drop in the oil price. Because when you translate even lower revenues into their weaker currency, it's almost balancing out.